Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the second day of Miami Air International Flight 293 major investigation. We've identified all of the parties who will be participating in this investigation, including, obviously, Miami Air International, the FAA, Boeing, CFM Engine Company, the Teamsters Union representing the pilots, the Flight Attendant Union, and the Navy is also going to be joining us as part of the parties. We have a full team in place now. We've been suffering some weather delays because of thunderstorms and lightning and heavy rain, which has complicated our efforts. I'd like to start off with the flight data recorder, which we recovered yesterday and was flown up to the NTSB laboratory in Washington, D.C., and we have a few numbers for you. Let me stress that this is preliminary information, but it'll at least get you started. The aircraft speed at touchdown, the airspeed, was 163 knots. The ground speed at touchdown was 178 knots, which translates roughly to about a 15-knot tailwind. The flap setting at touchdown was 30 degrees, and the ground spoilers deployed at 3 seconds after touchdown. The aircraft had been in maintenance, and the maintenance log noted that the left-hand thrust reverser was inoperative, and there are procedures to deal with that on the minimum equipment list. I would point out that this is preliminary information, and we'll have more for you as it becomes available. The second area is the salvage operations, and depending upon where the aircraft is removed to, whether it stays on Navy property or whether it's moved someplace off Navy property, will dictate how the aircraft is removed from the resting place at this point. Probably will involve a barge if it goes off of Navy property. We're going to be very careful about how we move the aircraft because we want to preserve it and all of the perishable evidence that goes along with that. So a great care will be emphasized in that. That will also allow us to get to the cockpit voice recorder, which is still in the tail of the aircraft and underwater. Before we can move the aircraft, we have to defuel it, take fuel off of it. And normally these aircraft are fueled and defueled underneath the wing. Because we can't get to the underside of the aircraft, we've had to cut holes in the top of the wing, and there's roughly 1,200 gallons of fuel remaining. And because of the weather and the storms and lightning, we've been very, very careful not to get too far into that. The Navy is helping us in managing that circumstance. Let me address the pets at this point because that's an area of concern for all of us. The Navy has arranged to have some divers that are probably on scene right now removing the pets from the forward cargo hold. The next section I want to get to is the flight operations, and again I will stress that we're very early into the process. We will expect to get a lot more as we get the cockpit voice recorder out. The original plan for the pilots was to land to the west on runway 28, and at some point as they arrived in the area, the pilots requested to air traffic control that they change the direction of landing and land to the east on runway 10. They were advised that the Navy had a arresting gear or wire barrier set up for recovery from Navy aircraft operating offshore in case they couldn't land on the carrier. What that does is it essentially reduces the length of available runway. So even though runway 10 is about 9,000 feet long, The pilots were advised that because of this barrier, which is located approximately 1,200 feet from the end of the runway, that displaced the threshold, making the effective length of the runway about 7,800 feet. So we'll be getting into much more detail on that as we have it. I already mentioned the cockpit voice recorder. When we recover it, will give us a lot more information on what the crew was thinking, internal discussions, and how they discussed things with air traffic control and their decision-making process. You can get your updates at, follow us at NTSB_newsroom. And if anybody has any witness video, we'll be looking for that, and that is witness@ntsb.gov. Again, I'd like to thank our friends at the Navy for being so supportive to us, to the first responders, and we'll take your questions. And if you would, please raise your hand. I'll call on you, and then identify who you are and who you're with. So, ma'am?
Allison Henning with News for Jacksonville here. You said that there are about 1,200 gallons of fuel remaining. Do we know how much has leaked into the river at this point, an estimate?
We do not have that data. I suspect that we'll know exactly how much fuel was on board the aircraft, but that's a little hard to tell. The Navy and their contractors have done a really excellent job, though, of containing it with the booms that they put around. We were out on the site yesterday, and I walked out on the approach light pier adjacent to the aircraft. You could smell the fuel, but from what I could tell, it was very nicely contained with several layers of booms. Next question. Sir.
Has this curtailed the training flights with other aircraft on base?
I will let Captain Connor answer that one.
In terms of training flights at the airfield, obviously during the weekend we don't do a lot of training flights. We are coordinating with our squadrons to allow some very limited flights tomorrow morning, starting at about 06:30. We want to get those aircraft out by 7:30 so that we can have our full attention to continued efforts. Those aircraft will not return to NAS JAX due to obviously the aircraft's location. We don't want to have any aircraft flying overhead or landing on runway 10.
So that's going to limit the Orions or P3 Orions?
Correct. Until we have the aircraft moved, we will continue to be closed. But again, we are allowing some aircraft to depart and reposition to another location so that they can continue to do their training.
Yes, sir.
Ryan Nelson, Action News JAX. Are there any concerns that the cockpit voice recorder may be damaged, or is there full faith that it's going to be operable when you get to it?
Any concerns that the cockpit voice recorder may be damaged? We're pretty confident at this point that the tail end of the aircraft is in very good shape, and these recorders are quite robust. So we have high confidence level that we'll be able to get it back and get a pretty thorough readout on it.
Vice Chairman.
Yes, sir.
You talk about a touchdown speed at about 178 knots. That's a little high for a 737, is it not? And with the thrust reverser out of service, can you characterize the landing speed, particularly when you have?
That's one of the things we're going to be looking at. Obviously, we have to take into account what the environment was at the time, what the weather conditions were, the aircraft configuration, and so I can't give you an answer on that right now.
But would you characterize the landing speed as high, as normal?
I can't tell you at this point because we can't make a determination on what was appropriate until we know the full condition and the environment in which it was. Ma'am?
Rosa Flores with CNN. You mentioned that normally aircraft land to the west, but in this particular case they asked to land to the east. Why was that?
The question is, aircraft normally land to the west, and why did they change? Aircraft typically will land into the wind, and so we can't characterize it as they normally land to the west. In this particular case, the airport was configured to land to the west. The pilots requested to change the active runway. We don't know what they were thinking or why they made that choice, and that will be one of the things that we look to find out as we go through the cockpit voice recorder. And I would also point out that there are ongoing interviews with the crew at this point, so we should get more. Sir?
Thank you. Tom Giusto, ABC News. Some of the passengers have told us they thought the top of the plane cracked on the landing. Do you have any information about whether the top of the plane cracked?
I have no information on that at all. I can assure you that our structures people will be looking very carefully at that, and will have made a thorough assessment probably before we move the aircraft. That would be a fairly obvious thing. Mr. Lovell, who's our investigator in charge, perhaps you'd like to address anything more on that?
The examination of the wreckage from the standpoint of trying to effectively recover it is ongoing at this point. As we stated earlier, it was delayed, but however, that is ongoing. And if there is damage to the wreckage, it will certainly be cataloged, and we will be able to give you more information on that. The priorities, however, are stated by the Vice Chairman, and that is where we're focusing on now, particularly with respect to removing it.
Can you describe, sir, some of the damage you've seen from what you've been able to assess, the state of the aircraft? Give us a sense for perhaps what the force of the impact and whatnot, just based on some of the damage you've been able to see.
Mr. Lovell?
How the aircraft is positioned now certainly gives you great limitation, puts a lot of limitations on a good, thorough assessment. We are not aware of the extent of the damage underneath the waterline simply because it's not seen. I think to be able to give you a decent assessment of the state of the aircraft at this time would not be really feasible, given the fact of how it's sitting, how it's positioned, and from what we see, it looks in reasonable condition above the waterline. But again, to be able to go into that deeper, we would not be able to give you an accurate indication right now.
One other point I'd like to make is the people doing the salvage are very experienced, and our team is very experienced as well. So they'll have a pretty good idea of what went on. Ma'am?
I wanted to ask about the passengers. Any other updates?
I don't have anything further on the passengers. Captain Connor, do you have any further information on the passengers?
The only thing I have to add on the passengers, they have all left the base. They've all gone on to further travels to their original destinations or whatever plans they had or maybe changed as a result of the incident.
One other curiosity I had about children being on board. Why would children be on board, like from Guantanamo Bay to Jacksonville?
I don't specifically know why. Obviously, there are Navy personnel assigned to Guantanamo Bay, but I think that we better we can follow up and get back to you on that.
Ma'am?
What are your other options to assess the damage if it were to be taken off-site on a barge or something like that?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question about other options. We will be moving the aircraft, and it will be taken to a secure place, and our team will have an opportunity to go through the aircraft thoroughly. I think the other point in terms of the damage is the benefit of having a full flight data recorder and full cockpit voice recorder and access to the flight instruments themselves. So that gives us a very good picture of what was going on before and during the accident sequence. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about what flight reversers do and what the significance of one of them being inoperable
The question is, what's the significance of thrust reversers being inoperative? I don't have a lot of detail on that. We will be looking very thoroughly at the maintenance of the aircraft in the several weeks probably prior to, and the condition of the thrust reversers will be obviously of interest. So we will be getting to that, but I don't have information on that right now.
Can you explain what they do? Do they help slow down a plane upon landing?
The function of the thrust reversers is to divert thrust from the engine. They don't actually reverse the engines themselves. The engines continue to operate as they always do, and then there are buckets or flow redirectors that will change the flow to help slow the airplane down. Thrust reversers are typically not used in performance calculations, however. Any other questions, sir?
At this stage of the investigation, can you speak to the pilot's experience?
I do not have any information on the pilot's experience. We will be looking very thoroughly at the pilots in terms of their training. We'll be looking at their flight experience. We'll be looking at their recent flight experience, medical condition, and also their fatigue and rest profile, probably back 72 to 96 hours.
Next question?
I have a question about the weather today. Is there any concern that any evidence has been destroyed because of the severe weather today?
Question regarding the weather today and the impact it has on the accident site. I don't believe there is, but let me defer to our investigator in charge who has been spending a great deal of time there, Mr. Lovell.
The impact of the weather today certainly delays our efforts. However, we feel that we got on board yesterday and started to look at the evidence that's available. We've been making some progress, and I think, based on my experience, it's a delay, but it's a delay in the interest of safety, and we do not want another accident to occur, and we have to do it properly. But I think the investigation is not compromised by taking precautions.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for being with us, and we will keep you updated as we have additional information. Thank you.
Are there any more updates for today scheduled for today, or?